The magnificent temples of ancient Egypt stand as monuments to one of history's most advanced civilizations. But beneath their golden facades lies a disturbing truth about how power operated in the land of the pharaohs. For more than 3,000 years, Egyptian royalty maintained control through a system of marriage arrangements that transformed intimate human relationships into calculated instruments of political domination. These were not romantic unions celebrated in Hollywood films, but methodical programs of exploitation that treated royal women as valuable assets to be managed, bred, and controlled for dynastic purposes. Archaeological evidence from tomb inscriptions, administrative papyri, and temple records reveals that Egyptian royal marriages operated according to principles that would be recognized today as systematic human trafficking. The pharaonic system required royal daughters to marry within their immediate families, often to brothers, uncles, or even fathers, creating bloodline purity that served both religious and political objectives. This was not an occasional practice driven by limited options, but a deliberate policy enforced by law and supported by elaborate religious doctrine. Royal children understood from birth that their personal desires were subordinate to dynastic requirements. Palace officials evaluated young princes and princesses like livestock, assessing their potential contributions to future political alliances. Girls were examined for beauty, fertility indicators, and psychological traits that would make them suitable for complete submission to palace authority. Boys were trained to view their future wives as political instruments rather than human companions. Learning to calculate the strategic value of different marriage combinations, the selection process began in early childhood and continued throughout adolescence. Royal daughters lived in isolation, permitted contact only with other women who had already been absorbed into the palace system. They received extensive education in palace management, religious ceremonies, and the arts of pleasing their future husbands, but were forbidden from developing emotional attachments to anyone outside their immediate family circle. Their daily lives were structured to eliminate any possibility of independent thinking or personal agency. Palace administrators maintained detailed genealogical charts spanning multiple generations, ensuring that future marriages would produce optimal combinations of royal bloodlines. These documents reveal calculations of unprecedented complexity, tracking genetic relationships with the precision of modern scientific breeding programs. Marriage contracts specified exactly how many children were expected from each union, what would happen if those children displayed physical defects, and how royal women would be punished for failing to meet their reproductive obligations. The religious framework supporting these practices was comprehensive and inescapable. Egyptian theology portrayed the pharaoh as a living god whose bloodline carried literal divine essence. Marrying within the family was not merely politically advantageous, but spiritually necessary to maintain the purity of godhood on earth. Royal women were taught that their suffering served sacred purposes, that their submission constituted worship, and that their bodies functioned as temples, serving causes greater than individual happiness. Temple priests developed elaborate theological justifications for practices they privately recognized as exploitation. Internal priestly correspondence reveals discussions about how to reconcile religious teachings with the obvious suffering witnessed in royal palaces. Rather than challenging the system, religious authorities created new doctrines that portrayed female submission as spiritually beneficial and resistance to dynastic duties as rebellion against divine order. The wedding ceremonies themselves were designed to break the psychological resistance of young women who might otherwise question their fate. Elaborate rituals required brides to publicly renounce their right to choose their own partners, their own futures, and their own destinies. These ceremonies extended over weeks, combining fasting, isolation, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to make participants grateful for their exploitation rather than resentful of it. By the time royal daughters reached their marriage beds, many had been so thoroughly conditioned that resistance seemed not just impossible, but morally wrong. Palace physicians kept detailed medical records tracking the reproductive health of royal wives, documenting menstrual cycles, pregnancy outcomes, and the success rates of various breeding strategies. These documents treat human reproduction with clinical detachment, describing procedures designed to maximize fertility without regard for the physical or emotional welfare of the women involved. When marriages failed to produce male heirs, the consequences for wives were immediate and severe, ranging from political exile to execution for failing in their primary dynastic duty. The harem system created environments of deliberate competition and psychological warfare. Royal wives were housed in quarters designed to foster rivalry rather than solidarity, competing desperately for access to their husbands while knowing that failure could result in death or banishment. Palace officials encouraged women to spy on each other, sabotage potential rivals, and form temporary alliances that could be broken whenever politically convenient. The natural bonds between women were systematically corrupted into weapons of mutual destruction. Different categories of royal women occupied distinct hierarchical positions based on their family relationships to the pharaoh. Direct sisters commanded the highest status and were expected to produce primary heirs. Cousins and half-sisters occupied middle tiers, serving as backup wives in case primary marriages failed to produce suitable children. The lowest tier consisted of royal daughters deemed unsuitable for marriage within the family, but too valuable to waste, often becoming priestesses or being given to foreign rulers as diplomatic gifts. Economic incentives underlying these practices reveal how deeply royal marriage was embedded in Egyptian governance. These unions consolidated wealth, managed inheritance across generations, and maintained political alliances throughout the kingdom. Marriage negotiations involved detailed financial arrangements, treating women as commodities to be traded between dynasties. Dowries included not just gold and land, but specific numbers of servants, craftsmen, and entire villages that would transfer ownership based on marriage success. The systematic exploitation of royal women generated resources that funded military expansion, monumental construction, and administrative operations throughout the kingdom. The economic impact was enormous, helping finance the construction of pyramids, temples, and palaces that continue to dominate the Egyptian landscape today. Palace treasuries maintained separate accounts for different categories of royal wives, tracking the economic value generated by their reproductive success and adjusting resource allocations. Based on their ability to produce male heirs, international diplomatic relationships often depended on successful royal marriages. Egyptian merchants negotiated commercial agreements that included provisions for future marriage alliances, treating royal daughters as collateral for international contracts. Foreign kingdoms offered their own royal women as guarantees for military support, creating networks of sexual exploitation that spanned the ancient Mediterranean world. Diplomatic correspondence reveals how neighboring rulers competed to provide suitable wives for Egyptian princes. Understanding that these marriages could secure crucial trade relationships and military alliances, the educational system for royal children ensured that each generation would perpetuate these cycles of exploitation. Young princes learned to conduct marriage negotiations where women were discussed, like valuable livestock. Their breeding potential and political connections weighed against dowry offerings and territorial concessions. They practiced evaluating potential wives based on their capacity to produce male heirs, their family's political reliability, and their psychological suitability for complete submission to palace authority. Royal sons grew up believing that their exploitation of women was divinely sanctioned, seeing themselves not as abusers, but as faithful servants of the gods, carrying out sacred duties that maintained cosmic order. Palace correspondence, preserved in tomb archives, shows princes seeking paternal advice on managing resistant wives, maximizing pregnancy rates, and maintaining control over increasingly large harems as their political power expanded. These discussions employed the same casual tone used for agricultural management or military logistics. The administrative machinery supporting these practices was extraordinarily complex. Palace bureaucrats coordinated the transportation of brides from distant locations, arranged religious ceremonies that legitimized incestuous unions, and oversaw wedding night rituals that transformed terrified young women into dynastic property. Surviving administrative documents describe these processes with bureaucratic detachment, treating human trafficking as routine governmental business, requiring careful logistical planning and resource allocation. Children born into this system inherited not just royal privilege, but also psychological conditioning that prepared them to continue these practices. Sons learned that women existed primarily for dynastic purposes, while daughters discovered that their futures would mirror the suffering they witnessed in their mothers and sisters. The palace education system ensured this cycle continued with devastating efficiency, creating royal cultures where systematic abuse became so normalized that questioning it seemed impossible. Royal daughters who showed signs of resistance faced increasingly severe restrictions until they submitted completely to palace authority. Those who continued to resist encountered punishments ranging from public humiliation to complete exile from their families and everything they had ever known. Palace records document which conditioning methods produced the most compliant wives, which rituals were most successful at preventing future resistance, and which combinations of psychological pressure created the most stable marriages from the dynasty's perspective. Medical procedures developed by palace physicians prioritized dynastic interests over patient health, comfort, or dignity. Surviving medical papyri describe treatments that would be considered torture by modern standards, all justified by the necessity of ensuring royal succession. Royal women were subjected to increasingly invasive examinations and interventions, designed to maximize reproductive success regardless of personal consequences. Foreign visitors to Egyptian palaces often commented on the strange behavior of royal women, describing them as unnaturally submissive, emotionally distant, and seemingly disconnected from normal human responses. These observers did not understand they were witnessing the results of systematic psychological destruction designed to create perfect dynastic vessels rather than complete human beings. The religious ceremonies blessing these marriages were carefully crafted to legitimize abuse by any modern standard. Young women participated in rituals where they publicly surrendered their autonomy as acts of devotion to the gods. These were not brief formalities but extended ordeals designed to completely reshape participants. Understanding of their own worth and purpose, the conditioning was so thorough that many royal brides expressed gratitude for their exploitation rather than resentment. Temple archives contain internal discussions among priests who struggled to reconcile their religious teachings with the obvious suffering they witnessed. Rather than challenging the system, they created new theological doctrines that portrayed female suffering as spiritually beneficial and resistance to dynastic duties as rebellion against natural order. The religious establishment developed increasingly elaborate justifications for practices they privately acknowledged as systematic abuse. Palace officials documented the psychological impact of this system with clinical precision, noting which methods most effectively destroyed individual will, and which combinations of isolation, competition, and religious indoctrination produced the most manageable royal wives. The systematic nature of this psychological manipulation reveals calculated cruelty, designed to make resistance seem not just futile, but spiritually wrong. The international influence of Egyptian practices extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Neighboring kingdoms adopted similar systems of royal marriage, viewing them as sophisticated approaches to dynastic management rather than human rights violations. The systematic exploitation of royal women became a template that other civilizations emulated, spreading Egyptian methods of matrimonial control throughout the ancient world. Modern Egyptologists initially refused to believe documentary evidence of these practices could be accurate, finding it difficult to reconcile the systematic nature of royal exploitation with popular conceptions of ancient Egyptian civilization. However, the archaeological record is too comprehensive to dismiss, revealing administrative structures, religious doctrines, and economic systems all designed to support the methodical dehumanization of royal women. The golden age of Egyptian civilization was built on this foundation of systematic sexual violence. With the monuments that continue to inspire wonder today, funded by profits derived from human trafficking operations conducted at the highest levels of government, understanding this history requires acknowledging that cultural achievements we admire were created through the deliberate destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. These practices were not cultural differences that can be dismissed with modern superiority, but deliberate policies that reduced human beings to breeding stock for the entertainment of those in power. The papyrus records document a machine designed to destroy the humanity of royal women, operating with terrifying efficiency because no one was willing to acknowledge what it actually represented. The voices of these queens deserve recognition, their suffering acknowledgement, and their humanity restoration through historical honesty. Only by confronting this darkness can we hope to prevent its return in new forms. Understanding how power structures can corrupt the most intimate aspects of human experience and transform what should be love into weapons of control. The documentation of these practices reveals that Egyptian royal exploitation was not limited to marriage ceremonies and reproductive duties, but extended into every aspect of daily existence within palace walls. Royal women lived under constant surveillance, with palace guards monitoring their movements, conversations, and interactions with other members of the court. Personal freedoms that common Egyptian women might have enjoyed were completely eliminated for those born into royal families. Palace schedules regulated when royal wives could eat, sleep, exercise, and even speak with their children. These timetables were designed not for efficiency or comfort, but for maximum psychological control. By regulating the most basic aspects of human existence, palace administrators ensured that royal women never developed the sense of personal autonomy that might lead to resistance or rebellion against their assigned roles. The architectural design of royal quarters reflected this systematic approach to control. Living spaces were constructed to facilitate surveillance while preventing private communication between residents. Walls were built with hidden passages, allowing palace officials to monitor conversations, while room layouts ensured that no gathering of royal women could occur without official oversight. Even bathing and personal grooming took place under supervision, eliminating any possibility of private moments where resistance might be planned or discussed. Food distribution within palace harems served multiple purposes beyond basic nutrition. Meals were used as rewards and punishments, with palace officials controlling portion sizes, menu selections, and eating schedules to reinforce behavioral expectations. Royal women who displayed appropriate submission received better food and dining privileges, while those showing signs of independence faced dietary restrictions that served as constant reminders of their powerless position within the palace hierarchy. The education system for royal children was carefully structured to perpetuate these practices across generations. Young princes received instruction not just in military strategy and administrative skills, but in the specific techniques required to manage multiple wives and maintain control over palace harems. They learned detailed protocols for conducting marriage negotiations, evaluating potential brides, and implementing the psychological conditioning necessary to ensure complete submission from their future wives. Palace libraries contained extensive collections of texts describing successful management techniques for royal women. With detailed case studies of particular dynastic marriages and their outcomes, these documents were studied by successive generations of royal sons, creating a body of institutional knowledge dedicated to the systematic exploitation of women. The preservation of these texts in royal tombs suggests that pharaohs considered this knowledge essential for successful rule, worthy of protection for use in the afterlife. Training programs for palace administrators included specialized courses in human psychology, designed to help officials identify and respond to signs of resistance among royal women. These bureaucrats learned to recognize the subtle behavioral changes that might indicate growing independence or rebellious thinking, allowing them to implement corrective measures before resistance could develop into organized opposition to the system. The medical establishment serving royal palaces developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for monitoring and controlling female fertility. Palace physicians created detailed charts tracking the menstrual cycles of all royal women, calculating optimal timing for reproductive encounters, and identifying potential problems that might interfere with pregnancy. These medical professionals were trained to view their patients not as individuals deserving care, but as valuable assets requiring maintenance for dynastic purposes. Pharmaceutical knowledge was applied specifically to enhance fertility and control behavior among royal women. Palace physicians developed medications designed to increase pregnancy rates, regulate menstrual cycles, and modify emotional responses in ways that would make women more compliant with their assigned roles. The surviving medical texts describe these treatments with clinical detachment, focusing on their effectiveness for dynastic purposes rather than their impact on patient welfare. The legal system supporting royal marriage practices created an entirely separate category of law, applicable only to members of the royal family. These special legal provisions eliminated rights and protections that might otherwise have been available to women in Egyptian society, creating a legal framework specifically designed to facilitate the systematic exploitation of royal daughters. Court records show that attempts by royal women to seek legal protection from abuse were routinely dismissed on the grounds that dynastic obligations superseded individual rights. Marriage contracts developed for royal unions were far more detailed and controlling than those used by ordinary Egyptians. These documents specified not just financial arrangements and inheritance provisions, but detailed behavioral expectations for wives, punishment procedures for various forms of noncompliance, and specific reproductive requirements that had to be fulfilled. The contracts were designed to eliminate any ambiguity about the complete surrender of personal autonomy expected from royal brides. Enforcement mechanisms for these marriage contracts were built into the palace administrative system, with specialized officials responsible for monitoring compliance and implementing punishments when necessary. These bureaucrats maintained detailed records of behavioral infractions, reproductive failures, and other deviations from expected norms, creating files that could be used to justify increasingly severe restrictions on individual freedom. The international diplomatic implications of these practices extended beyond simple marriage alliances to encompass complex networks of human trafficking that connected royal families across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs regularly exchanged daughters with foreign rulers, creating webs of obligation and control that facilitated trade relationships, military alliances, and territorial agreements. These diplomatic marriages were negotiated like commercial contracts, with human beings serving as collateral for international agreements. Foreign correspondence preserved in Egyptian archives reveals how neighboring kingdoms competed to provide suitable wives for Egyptian princes. Understanding that successful marriages could secure crucial advantages in trade negotiations and military support. Kings offered detailed descriptions of their daughters' physical attributes, fertility indicators, and psychological suitability for submission to Egyptian palace protocols, treating their own children like livestock being offered for sale. The cultural impact of Egyptian royal marriage practices spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, influencing the development of similar systems in neighboring civilizations. Archaeological evidence shows that kingdoms in Nubia, Syria, and Mesopotamia adopted modified versions of Egyptian methods, creating a regional network of systematic exploitation that operated across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Religious institutions throughout these allied kingdoms developed theological justifications for their own versions of royal marriage control, often borrowing directly from Egyptian priestly texts while adapting them to local religious traditions. This created a shared intellectual framework that normalized the systematic exploitation of royal women across multiple civilizations, making resistance more difficult by presenting these practices as universal rather than specifically Egyptian innovations. The economic benefits generated by systematic exploitation of royal women helped fund not just monumental construction projects, but also military expansion that spread Egyptian influence throughout the ancient world. Revenue streams created by marriage alliances, inheritance consolidation, and international bride trafficking provided resources that supported professional armies, administrative bureaucracies, and construction projects that required enormous investments of wealth and labor. Palace treasuries maintained separate accounting systems for revenues generated through royal marriage arrangements, treating income from human trafficking as a distinct category of governmental funding comparable to taxation or military conquest. These financial records reveal that profits from the systematic exploitation of women constituted a significant portion of royal income, making the entire Egyptian economic system partially dependent on the continued operation of these practices. The psychological conditioning techniques developed for royal women were so effective that they influenced broader approaches to social control throughout Egyptian society. Methods originally designed for palace harems were adapted for use in religious institutions, administrative offices, and military organizations, creating a culture of systematic psychological manipulation that extended far beyond the royal family. Educational institutions throughout Egypt began incorporating elements of palace conditioning techniques into their curricula, teaching students that individual desires were subordinate to societal obligations and that resistance to authority constituted rebellion against divine order. This created generations of Egyptians who had been trained to accept systematic exploitation as natural and beneficial, making broader social resistance to royal practices increasingly unlikely. The architectural and artistic legacy of ancient Egypt continues to inspire admiration, but understanding the true source of funding for these achievements requires acknowledging that monuments like the Great Pyramid and the Temple of Karnak were built with wealth generated through systematic human trafficking and sexual exploitation. The golden treasures displayed in modern museums represent not just artistic achievement, but the accumulated profits of practices that reduced human beings to commodity status for dynastic convenience. Archaeological excavations of royal tombs reveal that pharaohs considered their marriage control systems so important that they included detailed documentation of these practices in their burial preparations, apparently believing that successful exploitation of women would be necessary for maintaining power in the afterlife. These tomb inscriptions provide some of the clearest evidence of how thoroughly these practices were integrated into Egyptian concepts of successful leadership and divine authority. The systematic destruction of human dignity represented by Egyptian royal marriage practices was not an unfortunate side effect of ancient political systems, but a deliberate foundation of imperial power that operated with calculated efficiency for over 3 millennia. Recognition of this historical reality requires acknowledging that civilizations we admire for their cultural achievements were built on systematic violations of basic human dignity that continued because they served the interests of those with power to change them.